Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel discussion, The Profits of Slavery and the Wealth of Universities, a Transatlantic Conversation. This event is made possible by the British Association for American Studies, the U.S. Embassy, and the University of Birmingham International Engagement Fund, and the wonderful mind of Dr. John Monroe, who dreamed up this event and brought us all here today. My name is Michelle Cressfield. I am a lecturer of 20th century United States history here at the University of Birmingham, and it is my pleasure to serve as tonight's chair for what promises to be a very illuminating conversation. Tonight's discussion is born out of a desire to think through the very important question of how we can study, acknowledge, and redress the legacy of slavery and its contribution to the wealth accumulation of the university. The University of Glasgow has done this work, releasing a report in 2019, as has the University of Bristol, which has produced a study of its role in the slave trade. But many of us here at the University of Birmingham have also naturally been thinking about how would such a study and investigation look in our own setting. Tonight, to share with us how investigation might take shape, we have Dr. Afua Cooper, a professor of history at Dalhousie University. Her research interests are African Canadian studies with specific regard to the period of enslavement and emancipation in 18th and 19th century Canada and the Black Atlantic, African Nova Scotia history, political consciousness, community building, and culture. She is the author of numerous works of poetry as well as historical scholarship, including The Hanging of Angelique, The Untold Story of Canadian Slavery and the Burning of Old Montreal, and the 2009 children's book, My Name is Phyllis Wheatley, A Story of Slavery and Freedom. Dr. Cooper is also the founder and current chair of the Black Canadian Studies Association. But for the purposes of our talk tonight, we're very happy to welcome her as the chair of the scholarly panel on Lord Dalhousie's relationship to race and slavery. And she's also the lead author of the report that was released in relationship to that study. So welcome, Dr. Cooper. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sharing their insights and responses to the report, we're very lucky to be joined by two dynamic discussants. First, we have Danny Ebanks Ingram, a curator, community organizer, and activist and performance artist whose multidisciplinary practice centers on queerness and Blackness with special attention to their connections to other aspects that underpin our society, such as economics, socio-political, and environmental elements of life. Currently, Danny is a co-founder and creative engagement at Civic Square, a public square neighborhood lab and creative participatory platform focused on regenerative civic and social infrastructure within neighborhoods. Thank you, Danny, for being with us.
Thank you.
And last but certainly, definitely not least, we have Dr. Asha Rogers, who is a lecturer in contemporary post-colonial literature here at the University of Birmingham. Dr. Rogers teaches and researches on the role of literary and cultural institutions, cultural policies, and organizations and how they shape 21st century literary history. She's interested in how forms of political liberalism have shaped culture through these structures and how acts of literary writing have responded to these demands in turn. She is the author of the 2020 book, State-Sponsored Literature, Britain and Cultural Diversity After 1945. So thank you, Dr. Rogers, for being here with us. So just by way of format, Dr. Cooper will speak for about 30 minutes on the history of the study and some of its key findings. We'll then have responses from Dr. Rogers and Danny, and then we'll open that up to a discussion between the four of us before we then take a Q&A from the wider audience. So definitely be getting your questions in order because we want to hear from you. So first, Dr. Cooper, if you want to take us away.
Thank you, Michelle. I just want to ask if you can hear me. Okay, very good. Thank you. So thank you, Michelle, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to also thank Danny and Asha and Matt for being part of this and for helping to realize the panel. And I want to thank a big thank you to John Monroe for issuing the invitation and working with me throughout the weeks leading up to this. I'm also gonna, if you could give me a minute, I'm gonna ask my daughter to just keep it quiet. Please stop doing that. So as the theme, the topic talks about, the topic is a title, The Profits of Slavery and the Wealth of Universities. And I want to look at my own university and with respect to the West India trade. And the West India trade was really what anchored Nova Scotia into the global economy. My university, the one I currently teach, is called Dalhousie University. And it's in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is in Eastern Canada. That area of Canada, we call it the Maritimes. And when Newfoundland is included, we call that area the Atlantic region. So that would be Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. That makes up the Atlantic region. Without Newfoundland, the area is called the Maritimes. And so Dalhousie University is like the flagship university for the Maritime provinces. It was founded in 1818, and it came about because of the slave trade, because of the slavery in the Caribbean. There are other entanglements with regards to slavery and Blackness with the university, but this evening I'm gonna be focusing on the West India trade, and I'll also speak briefly about the slavery compensation money and how that Dalhousie University was involved with that. So let's go. What happened in 2016 was the president of the university at the time, Richard Florizone, and the chair of Senate, Kevin Hewitt, really commissioned this report on Dalhousie's involvement with Atlantic slavery. But the Black Faculty and Staff Caucus also played a role. We were having a lot of issues of anti-Black racism on campus. Racist graffiti, Black students were routinely stopped by on-campus security. And you know, the university was going to commemorate its 200th anniversary. It was going to be the bicentenary of Dalhousie University in 2018, 200 years. So the university was all prepped for the celebration. And we said, hey, there's an elephant in the room. This is coming from the Black faculty. Lord Dalhousie was a racist. He was an Afrophobe. How can we talk about celebrating the school and this man when he hated Black people? We really had no idea how really involved the university was with slavery and anti-Blackness until the research commenced. So I chaired the panel. There's a scholarly panel that was put together to look into this investigation. I chaired the panel, and I also led a research team. Myself was the lead researcher. We had over time 4 people who came on as researchers on the project, and we researched within Nova Scotia itself, in Dalhousie Archives, in the Provincial Archives, National Archives in Ottawa, and also at the National Archives in London, and also at the Scottish National Archives. Because Scotland, because Dalhousie was a Scotsman, he came from the Edinburgh area, and his castle, or the family seat, is still in Scotland. The Dalhousie Castle is now an upscale hotel and spa. The family has another castle in the Aberdeen area. So doing this research really opened our eyes to this deep connection that university had with Caribbean slavery. And so this is, I start off by showing these sculptures by Kwame Akoto Bamfo at the National Museum for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, to exemplify what it meant. Well, we don't even know what it meant. We can only imagine, because we weren't slaves. We know Black people still suffer the intergenerational trauma, but these visual representations give you an idea of the horror, of the brutality, of the misery that Black people endured during these 3-4 centuries of transatlantic slavery and the slave trade. The ownership of one's body, the ownership of one's womb, the reproductive violence that was meted out to Black people during this period. And so the image on my left, it would be your right, is the old Dalhousie University, which is, it's actually now the City Hall for Halifax. It's refurbished. There is George Ramsay, who is Lord Dalhousie, in the middle image there, and the other image with the autumn leaves, that's the current administrative building called the Hicks Building right there. So as I've said before, Dalhousie was a Scotsman from the Edinburgh area. He came to Nova Scotia as the Lieutenant Governor of the province. He had just, in 1816 he arrived. He had just left Europe as a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. He fought in the Napoleonic Wars. He was at Waterloo with Wellington, and he was sort of gifted this appointment as Lieutenant Governor of the province. So he came out in 1816, and as soon as he arrived, he launched this campaign to get rid of the Black people of Nova Scotia. His arrival coincided with another arrival, and that is the refugees of the War of 1812 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The War of 1812, which was an aspect of the Napoleonic Wars, had ended, and Dalhousie, African-American enslaved people during that war in the United States had fought, thousands and thousands of them had fought on the side of the British. The British issued this memo saying to enslaved people, if you would join us, join the British standard, at the end of the war, you get your freedom. Of course, thousands ran away from their masters, joined the British, fought as soldiers, Marines, cooks, spies, engineers, and at the end of the war, upwards of 3,000 were transported to Eastern Canada, the majority to Nova Scotia. So their arrival, so between 1813 and 1817 was when the 3,000 people arrived. But it coincided with the arrival of Lord Dalhousie, and he had conceptualized Nova Scotia as a white man's country. He wanted veterans from the Napoleonic Wars, from Ireland and Scotland and England, and foreign Protestants like Swiss and German to come and make Nova Scotia their home. He didn't want Black people there. He shared in the widespread racist belief in what he called idleness and lack of industry of Black people. And he thought Black people were slaves by habit and education. So even though these Black refugees, as they were called after the War of 1812, had, through their own agency, swam through rivers and creeks, ran away, fought for the British, Dalhousie still saw them as lazy. And in one of his letters to Lord Bathurst, his superior, he said they were constitutionally inferior. So here, the language of eugenics before we even got into that time period. So, as I've said, he made several references to the natural inferiority of Black people. So you have this man who's the head of the government, he's the official of the crown, the man who's supposed to put in practice the promises that the British had made to the Black refugees. So one, they would get land upon arrival in a British colony, in this case, Nova Scotia. They would be given seeds and tools and blankets and, promised civil rights, voting rights, and so on. Dalhousie was a person in charge, and the governor before him, of putting these promises into action. So imagine Do you think he's gonna do that, or is he gonna do it in a wholesome way when he believed that Black people were naturally inferior and that they shouldn't be in the province anyway? So that's the kind of man we're dealing with. That's the kind of man after whom the university was named. And that's the legacy that the Black community in Nova Scotia and in Canada endured for 200 years and still continue to endure. So we gleaned 5 main entanglements in our research of the university's involvement with slavery. But I'm gonna just speak on number 2 and on number 4. I have touched on the Black refugees, so you do get an idea. This is an image of some of the Black refugees arriving in Halifax. And this painting was commissioned by the Army Museum. It was launched about 4 years ago. It's a beautiful image. I really, really love it because it shows the hope and the optimism in the faces of the children and the men and the women. They would have been coming from the Chesapeake area in the United States. That's Maryland and Virginia. The Castine Fund is important to our topic. In fact, the Castine Fund is a smoking gun because this money from the Castine Fund was used by Lord Dalhousie to make up the original endowment for the university in 1818. And we'll get to we'll talk more about the Castine Fund later on. Just a note to say that the Castine Fund was money that was taken from the customs house in Castine, Maine. During the War of 1812, British and Canadian military sailed down to Castine, Maine. It was American, so it was fair game. Captured the customs house and basically stole the custom duties that came up to about 12,000 pounds at the time. And they took this money back to Halifax. So they basically held up Castine, took the money, all in the name of war. So when Dalhousie arrived, he noted that the money was there, the 12,000 pounds was there, and he asked his superior, Lord Bathurst, what to do with the money, because there were several recommendations coming from his legislature. Some people said he should build a prison, others said he should build a shopping mall, some said just spend it on road work and so on, but he didn't want to do that. Bathurst proposed that he could use the money to help the refugees who were coming into the province. Dalhousie disagreed. He didn't want to use the money for that purpose. So this is the main connection that I want to talk about this evening, and this is the West India trade, how the West India trade connects to Nova Scotia. So the West India trade meant that maritime and other Canadian businessmen built the Caribbean infrastructure, slavery infrastructure, by exporting to the Caribbean salted fish, pork, beef, and these form the main protein source for enslaved Caribbean people, wheat flour, horses, timber, staves, and other building products. Caribbean planters paid for these Canadian products with slave-produced rum, sugar, molasses, cocoa, and other products. And as you can see there, and you know, we're talking mainly about the period of British colonial dispensation, but even under the French regime, which ended in 1760, in Eastern Canada, in what is today Cape Breton, also in Quebec, the merchants there, was a mercantilist regime. The merchants in French Canada also integrated their particular colony into the world economy through the West Indies trade. In Cape Breton, for example, Ile Royale, the big trade was the cod trade, which they traded the cod across the ocean to Europe and to the Mediterranean, but also down the ocean to play the French colonies like Martinique and Haiti and Guadeloupe. Capital earned from investments in the West India trade allowed some of these businessmen to invest in and establish such complementary industries as shipping, banking, and insurance. So this is how Halifax and Nova Scotia, remember Dalhousie is in Halifax. This is how this part of the world inserted itself in global trade through the West India trade. And many made their fortunes from this trade. Revenue from the West India trade formed the tax base of the colony. This is also important. It was the incoming ships that were taxed. It was the money from the taxes that the incoming ships had to pay that formed that provided a pool of money that the province used for infrastructural projects, grand home to build grand homes, and to build educational institution. So I talk here, I mentioned shipbuilding, how many merchants went into shipbuilding and also banking, merchants who made their fortunes through the West India slave system. And I ended by saying, therefore, this trade was part and parcel of the British triangular trade system, which was underpinned by the commerce in kidnapped African bodies and the labor wrung from these bodies to produce colonial wealth. And I was mentioning shipbuilding. Shipbuilding was an important part of the colonial economy in Eastern Canada. Several ships that were built in this part of the world were also used in the transatlantic slave trade. Ships were built for merchants in Bristol, in Liverpool, in London. Here is one very active West India trader, a man by the name of Joshua Major. He was from the Channel Islands, perfectly bilingual. I think his background was mainly French, but then he sort of defected to the English, and he was a kingmaker in Nova Scotia. He decided who was going to be premier, sort of. And here in 1852, Joshua Major advertised in the local paper about a group of enslaved people whom he had brought up to Halifax, and he was going to sell them on the market, just imported and to be sold by Joshua Major in Halifax, several Negro slaves. These enslaved people came up from the Caribbean. It could have been the British Caribbean, could have been the French Caribbean, it could have been the Dutch Caribbean, because Joshua Major traded to the British West Indies and also what they call the foreign West Indies. And you know, he has children, he has adults, and he's advertised them for sale. So it's not just that they're bringing up the rum and the molasses and so forth. They're also bringing up human beings as part of this West India trade system. This is Cronan's Wharf in Halifax, and I included this image because it's important. If you look in the foreground and at the background, you will see these barrels. You'll see these barrels and casks. They are the containers for the beef and the pork and the salted cod. That's going to be sent down to the West Indies, and then in the West Indies they would be rinsed out and washed, and then the rum and the molasses and sugar, coffee, etc., would be placed in these barrels and staves and sent up to the Atlantic. So I mentioned that part of this trade was timber and lumber. This these products were very, very important because from the timber you would produce staves that were used for barrel and construction, barrel, pails, so forth. Here is an image called Shipping Sugar. This is from Antigua. You see the barrels there. They're made by staves. And these two people are pushing it out on this kind of dolly thing to go on the boat, which is going to take the boat out to the waiting ship. And it's going to come up to Canada. It's going to come up to New England, the sugar, or it could just go across the ocean to Europe. But I wanted to underscore how important these barrels were. Oftentimes we overlook them. The West Indies colonies supplied Nova Scotia with 90% of its imported sugar. So you could be in Nova Scotia, in some rural community, you might not even have seen a Black person in your life, but you were using sugar from the West Indies. You were sweetening your cake with molasses. You were drinking rum. To become an official Newfoundlander, you have to kiss a fish and you have to drink what's called screech rum. Screech rum is Jamaican overproof rum. That's how you're become a baptized Newfoundlander. And so people participating in these activities without even thinking of the implications, especially in terms of history, especially in terms of slavery, and in terms of colonialism. There's colonialism right on your doorstep. There is slavery right on your doorstep. There's slavery in your kitchen without that being in your consciousness, the fact of that. So many of these merchants, and some of the names are there, I'm sure people will recognize Samuel Cunard, were West India merchants. That's how they made their fortunes. Mather Byles Allman was a governor at Dalhousie University and also at King's College, a sister school to Dalhousie University. He sat on the board of governors. He was a West India trader. And he used money from the West India trade to open the Bank of Nova Scotia in 1832. Bank of Nova Scotia is an international bank. How many people are aware that this bank came out of money that was made in the slave trade? I talked about inbound ships paying the tolls, inbound ships from the West Indies, and this money made up the pool of money for provided the tax base for the colony. Now, let me get to the Castine Fund. So the West India trade, and the Castine Fund, by the way, is also part of the West India trade. In New England, where Castine is currently in Maine, they also made their money by taxing ships coming up from the West Indies. This is how Castine, Maine also made its money. New England, as you will have read in the works of people like Wendy Warren, New England Bound, made its money from slavery before slavery became a big deal in the American South. And the slavery that provided the tax base for the New England colonies was, of course, Caribbean slavery. And so when the Canadians went down and stole this money from Castine, Maine, and took it back to Halifax, as I said, Lord Dalhousie used the Castine Fund to provide the endowment for the university. It was called Dalhousie's College in 1818. So to build the buildings, to pay the professors, to buy the desk and whatever else, to get the wood for the fireside during winter, it all came from the Castine Fund. Now, the university also received additional monies from the provincial legislature. And the provincial legislature got its money, as I've said before, the pool of its money from the West India trade. So everywhere you look across Dalhousie University, when you look at the documents of the House of Assembly during this period. When you look at the shipping news, when you look at the custom duties documents, because we looked at all of that, all of those documents, you see the importance of the trade between the maritime colonies and the Caribbean colonies. And so my colleague, Dr. Shirley Tillotson, put together this chart to break down how much money the university got from Castine, how much money it got from the province over the course of 5 years to establish the university. And it continues to get money from the provincial legislature throughout its existence, I mean, to this day, right? So let's just move on. And here in today's dollars it explains here, this chart, how much a Castine fund, the $13,000 or the 11,000 pounds, 11,596 pounds today would be worth close to $1 million. So the breakdown is there. So I'm going to move quickly to the Slavery Emancipation Compensation Award. We have looked at this, and of course, Professor Nicholas Draper, I'm sure you know who he is, in his book, Legacies of British Slave Ownership, has information on Mather Byles Allman. When you go in that book, you put in, or in the website, they have this beautiful website and database. Okay, let's see if there are any Canadians in this database, because you know one of the myths that we have to live with in Canada is that there was no slavery in Canada. Somehow Canada was involved in Atlantic trade. And no, like I said, it's a myth. It's not true. Canada, Nova Scotia had its own internal slavery, but the region was also intimately connected with slavery in New England and in the West Indies. So here we found Mather Byles Allman, who was a co-awardee of slave compensation money paid by the British government to people. I was going to say Caribbean slave owners, but we know they were in all over Britain, and some were in Canada. So Mather Byles, who was married into the Johnson family, the Allman family and the Johnson family, they received slavery compensation money. The Johnson family was a Jamaican white family, and at the end of slavery, they didn't want to live in Jamaica anymore, and they came to Nova Scotia and did very well. They were political, family, banking, business, and you know, they did very well in the province. They were involved in slave ownership in Jamaica, and they were paid out. And so you have many of Dalhousie's early leaders, whether they were on the board of governors, whether they were the first dean of the medical school, whether they were married into families of important people at the university. You find Dalhousie University being, you know, enmeshed in this, what I call in the circuit of slavery. So I'll give you just an idea of how that also operates. You find families marrying each other. It's the same people who are marrying each other. And many members of these families sit on the board of governors, or they have important leadership positions. Like again, the Allman family, they helped to establish the medical school. They helped to establish some important hospitals in the city, and they provided people who became important politicians. And so you find in that way, it's almost like a family compact, how they rule society. Nowadays, people would say they were the 1% at the time. And I'll just talk about, again, how these things happen when you least expect them to happen. In December 2015, we had a dinner at the home of the president, Richard Florizone, president of the university. And we were about to launch this project. and he had us over. And as I was leaving the house, I looked down and I saw this little plaque on one side. So of course, I'm a historian, I read every plaques. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is just too weird. You know, Carl Jung would call it synchronicity, because the plaque says that this house, this residence of the president, the official residence of the president, was originally built and owned by Levi Hart, a Halifax merchant involved in the West India trade. So I turned to the president and I said, your house is this symbol of slavery, your house that sits right in the middle of campus, because it was built by a merchant who made his fortune in the West India trade. So the house is still there. It's a beautiful home. It's the official home of the president. And that's another connection that we will be teasing out. So the West India trade that's the thread that we followed to get to how our university was so connected really to the slave trade. There are other examples of anti-Blackness. If we look at one of the things I want to say is how today Dalhousie University is still seen as this White Castle on the hill, almost an inaccessible place for many Black people. These institutions were built literally on the backs of enslaved Black people, to which they had little access and to which their descendants had little access or no access at all. Talking about some of the legacies of slavery, racism within the province of Nova Scotia, within the country of Canada, Black people are disproportionately impacted. When we look at social indices, health, education, criminal justice, you see how Black people are disproportionately represented on the negative side in these areas. I just want to point this out, that this is a recent report that was done in 2020 from the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and it says Black people, in particular Black men, are 20 times as likely to be shot dead by a police, 6 times more likely to be taken down by a police dog. So here you have the echoes of slavery. And yet Black people make up only about 8% of the Toronto population. In Nova Scotia, where I live, Black people only make up 3% of the Halifax population, but they are 9 times as, you know, we're saying as likely, but it's not even as likely. They are 9 times more street checked than white people, who make up the majority of the population. So these, we are positing, are some of the legacies of slavery. This whole idea, this practice of surveilling Black people. We are under constant surveillance, you know, being shot down all the time, being taken down by police dogs, being Black students dropping out of high school, 40%. Where did that come from? And I hear echoes, when I read these statistics, I hear echoes of Lord Dalhousie saying, Black people are idle, they're lazy, they're constitutionally inferior. And I'm positing that in the minds of whites today in Canada, there, whether it's conscious knowing or unconscious knowing, those ideas are still residing in the minds of white people. Racism, of course, we know it's structural, it's systemic. So perhaps there's some good news. At my school, we have launched certain initiatives to, for example, to launch a major in Black Studies and to develop a Bachelor of Arts program in Black Studies. The Sankofa Scholarship will be launched for Black students from the British West Indies and also for Black Canadian students. And it's a generous scholarship. It will provide about $12,000 a year for 4 years of undergraduate education. And there are other initiatives that are going to be rolled out, like cluster hiring of Black faculty. The legacies of racism, slavery, and injustice continue to oppress Nova Scotia and Canada's Black communities. On September 5th, 2019, the report was launched. And I want to show this image because I'm holding up a chain. It's a slave shackle. And, you know, I didn't get it from Virginia, United States, or from Jamaica. I got it from the Age of Sail Museum in Nova Scotia. The Age of Sail Museum in historical times was a shipbuilding place. They built ships there. And some of the ships were used in the West India trade. We think some of the ships were actually used in the transatlantic slave trade. But when they were excavating the site, they found all kinds of instruments of torture, like the shackle. In that shipbuilding site, the owner would bring enslaved people from Antigua to work in shipbuilding on that site. And it's right by the ocean. And every now and then, the curator told me the ocean would wash up these instruments of torture. So I will stop there, and I want to thank you very much. What we have done is we have gone back to the past and to bring that knowledge, that suppressed knowledge, to the present and to share it with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Afua, for that really interesting presentation. So now we'll have a response from Asha and then from Danny.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you, Dr. Cooper. It's really great to be part of this conversation. Thanks to John Munro for asking me, and Danny, it's really great to meet you as a fellow collaborator in these questions too. So I'm not here as a historian, let alone as a historian of slavery or of the university, but as someone who has thought around the kinds of expressive acts that take place or have taken place in institutions, particularly acts of literary creativity or acts of creativity more generally. But I've also thought a bit about the way that institutions are themselves expressive in the kinds of declarations that they make, the kinds of policies that they adopt, the many ways in which they signify or speak, including the ways in which they spend money or receive money or redeploy resource. So all of this is expressive and signifies something. So I read this report, which I really encourage you to go and look at, even if it's just the executive summary, as, among other things, an expressive act. And Dr. Cooper is part of a long history of scholars intervening in the life of institutions as part of their public service, and part of a long history of creative artists who've moved in and outside of these institutional structures. And I love the way that we see something of Dr. Cooper's creative practice in the epigraph to her report at the very beginning. It was a quotation from one of your poems. And maybe we can come back to these questions of how all of this interacts with creativity a bit later. But for now, there's several things that struck me that I just wanted to mention here. So I was struck by the conscious and necessary engagement across temporalities, across the past, the present, and the future. As Dr. Cooper has said, this report really actively begins by inviting us to think about the legacies of 1812 in the present with street checks in Halifax in ways that are very resonant for us in the UK, very resonant in Birmingham. And I think that symbol of the House of Levi Hart that you just mentioned is another really resonant symbol of a kind of racialized ivory tower that exists in the kind of spatial economy of our university campuses. Secondly, I wanted to flag the significance of this as an inquiry led by scholars with serious expertise, and the significance of this as a scholarly panel. And that feels in some ways weird to bring up, but it's also really important to stress given where we are right now in the UK. and the kind of nature of the situation that we face here in the UK in terms of the undermining of academic integrity, particularly as it's engaging with issues of the legacies of slavery and of colonialism. So for us in Birmingham or at the university, we know that there are very tangible connections between the British Empire and the composition of our city today, including inequalities in housing, the underinvestment in communities outside of the city centre or outside of places like Edgbaston. But we also know that Birmingham is, and I'm going to actually steal a sentence from the report, and instead of Halifax or Dalhousie, insert Birmingham. So we also know that Birmingham is, quote, a premier site in which a unique Black identity was shaped and established. The West Midlands ranks as an important epicentre of the Black diaspora. So we can think about these connections in terms of the goods Birmingham produced, commodities that passed through it, the flow of finance and taxation, the cultural institutions funded with private as well as public finance. In Capitalism and Slavery, Eric Williams notes that by 1750, there was hardly a trading or manufacturing town in England which was not in some way connected with the triangular or direct colonial trade, and that these profits provided one of the mainstreams of the accumulation of capital that financed the Industrial Revolution. And Williams goes on to talk about the wrought iron, the nails, the guns that Birmingham exported to the plantations in significant amounts. And he quotes a historian of the city who's writing in 1894. So this is just a few years before the University of Birmingham receives its royal charter from Queen Victoria, which is in 1900. So this historian of Birmingham in 1894 says that he talks about how Birmingham's interest in the colonial system can be expressed by, quote, the axes from India, the axes for India, the tomahawks for North America, to Cuba and Brazil went chains, handcuffs and iron collars. In the primeval forests of America, the Birmingham axe struck down the old trees. In East India and the West, they tended the fields of sugarcane with Birmingham hoes. The UCL's Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, which Dr. Cooper's already mentioned, also shows that compensation claims are positioned really on the edge of our campus in the form of one Frederick Whitmore, who lived on Wellington Street in Edgbaston. So if you're in Edgbaston, maybe you can go walk about and find Wellington Street. So this wealth is very much knocking at our collective campus door. So the report, I think, gives us ways to think about all of this in relation to the people who experience the space of our campus today, gives us ways of thinking about how the city relates to the campus and how the socioeconomic life trajectories of descendants of people whose lives were shaped by Joseph Chamberlain, the first Chancellor of the University of Birmingham, and his policies as Secretary of State for the colonies. So we can also think about policy and the way it shapes people's lives today who are descended of those affected by those policies. There is a history of the University of Birmingham being authored at present, I think, and I'm curious about what story this will tell, or indeed not, about this relationship that we're exploring. And I'm interested in this precisely because this is a university that at various points, perhaps today as well, has accommodated researchers who are keenly interested in asking some of these questions as researchers, but also as teachers. And I'm thinking not only of my peers like Michelle, but also some of my predecessors in the School of English Drama and Creative Studies, including Richard Hogger and Stuart Hall. And both of those scholars had particularly distinct ways of thinking about the kind of work that a School of English might do as a community of staff and of student researchers and learners. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asha. Danny, would you like to offer some thoughts?
Before Danny go on, Michelle, I just want to apologize to you and the panel. I went way over my time, and I've just noticed that you were alerting me in the chat, but I just kept on. I didn't see it. Sorry. Next time, ring a bell. Sorry, guys.
That's fine. Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper, for that like expansive presentation and what it's kind of like pulled out for me, I'd just like to share a few things from what I read in the report, and then also just things that have kind of come to me while you were speaking. Asha, thank you so much for what you've shared as well. I'm really excited to be here, firstly. So there was something that kind of really came to like the forefront of my mind when in the report it starts to speak about kind of almost the bribe of a freedom for these Black refugees. It's almost like in obligation to contributing to like the British military, for example. And I just wanted to quickly share a quote that I feel like I overuse this, but it always feels like so right. And it's a quote from Eddie Glaude, and it's in his book where it's part of his work where he's speaking around James Baldwin. But he says, the bribe is your silence. The bribe is just pursue your craft, make your money. The bribe is to adjust yourself to injustice. And there's something about that that really resonates with what we've kind of been touching on today, in the way that, you know, there's always this thing of you're helping the British military, or you're helping this trade, you're part of this really insidious kind of cycle without this kind of recognition of what you're doing physically, mentally. And it kind of made me really think kind of back to the point that Dr. Cooper made about these barrels, right, and these really ritualistic things of drinking rum, and you know, this is something that is seen as a place of celebration and a place of connection to this new experience. It is welcoming, with the lack of thought to what that process is to even get there, to even get those barrels, to even like, what is the process of sugar being made, what is the process of picking cotton, what is the process of you know, or what toll that takes on a body, right? Because at that time, Black bodies, even now we can argue, were not seen as bodies, right? And it's seen as just kind of a form of cattle in a lot of ways. And it really just made me think a lot about that bribe, and also what we still see today within lots of institutions, lots of organizations, where the idea of decolonizing is looked at as necessary, but sometimes not the whole process of that. Because I think the whole process of decolonizing is really tough. It's not easy, right? It's and that's a part of why, when we are thinking about decolonizing, what that means as a member of staff that works in an organization, that works at an institution, what does that mean for you personally in that role? And there's something about that, and I'd just like to kind of link back to Birmingham with the Past is Now exhibition, and the curators, kind of the co-curators of that. So we had like Alia, Hasina, Shaheen Kasim, Abira Karam, and Samaya Kasim, and Sarah Myers, and what that means to allow a cohort, allow a co-curation of work in a space that is now trying to have this conversation about decolonizing, but also the follow-up of what that means as well, with people that you are inviting in a space that kind of, you know, often doesn't look at its history and what that really means. I'm really interested in how we look at these conversations of decolonizing, and how we kind of think and reimagine ways that we learn about our past, you know, how it's kind of still manifesting now, and how we move forward with this and what that means. And I do think it's a sticky, difficult process, and I don't think it's something that should ever be looked at lightly. It is a real commitment to unpacking a lot of different kind of areas. I've written quite a lot down here, sorry. There was something else from the report as well that made me kind of think of how, you know, how the history of these words of like idleness and, you know, this like lack of motivation and like Black bodies, Black people at that time feeling that, and how that manifests now, right? And how that manifests when we're talking about just people in power and what those mindsets really mean. We see it every day on Twitter, like it's still here, right? It's not something that has just kind of dissipated. And I think there's something about reconnecting those areas of thought and acknowledging that it's still here. It's still here. It's still like very relevant. Even, you know, when Dr. Cooper mentioned about kind of, you know, like sugar and that just like being in your kitchen, right? Like that is a direct connection to how we live our everyday lives, you know? But yes, I'm really interested in kind of how we look at almost this washing up of evidence and torture, these like shackles coming up on the, like up through the sea and onto the shore, and what that means for us. And it felt really poetic when you mentioned that, because it was almost like that's the journey that we take when we're thinking in a way that is decolonial. Let me just have a look at my notes and see if there's anything else that I wanted to add. Yeah, there was something in the report about the slave trade and like economy and universities growing together in this really like nurturing, interlocking way. I'd really like to get maybe into that a little bit when we go into the discussion. But yeah, thank you for just what we've shared so far. It's felt really insightful.
Thank you. Those were great. Yeah, so not to cut you off, Dr. Cooper, also too, I didn't want to stop you because you were like just getting to like the really good stuff towards the tail end of the discussion. But if you want to respond to anything that's just been said, that'd be wonderful.
You know, a big thank you to Asha and Danny. No, I agree with everything that they have said. Really thought provoking. No, I don't want to respond to either one. I do agree with their comments.
So I just had a thought as Danny was speaking about, I was telling Asha before we started that John Monroe and I and other colleagues, Nathan Carden and Steve Hewitt at UOB, we've been teaching the 1619 project. And Danny, there's this really interesting article about sugar, and it's linked to diabetes and African-American health disparities and the ways in which sugar is the backbone of the slave economy, and thinking about the past is now exhibit as well, and how, you know, one of the kind of excuses in thinking about, or these kind of refusals to think about the history of slavery is that it's in the past, it's not with us. And I think the powerful thing about this report is that it is, and not in a way that's presentist, because often as historians, we're always kind of discouraged from presentism. But I think that this is not, it's not presentism. I think that it is a really useful and legitimate historical exercise in thinking about historical legacies and the ways in which these ideas really persist with us. And so one of the things I put to my students was, what would a 1619, well, it wouldn't be called 1619, of course, but what would such a project look like from the British perspective as we think about those legacies? And I think that this report and the work that, you know, universities do when they do this is one kind of approach to that, but there could be a multitude of things that I think would be that are just so fruitful. And I think that the report provides us a really beautiful kind of example of potential for what could be. So I know, Asha, you had some questions, Danny had some questions. So you want to kick us off, Asha?
Thanks, Michelle. My first question was really to ask Dr. Cooper about some of the judgments that you make as you arrived at the particular focus the report would take. And I kind of as I was rereading Eric Williams earlier on, I was thinking about this relationship between the economic base kind of driving things and then the relationship also to particular racist attitudes. And I wondered about the decision to combine both literally to follow the money, as it were, but also to locate and contextualize and bring into the frame particular historical attitudes. So I was kind of interested in the fact that you did both of those things. Was it ever just tempting to be like, do you know what, we're just going to follow the money, keep it simple, follow the money? But you also brought in the attitudes of this individual. I wonder if you could speak about that.
Right, thank you, Asha. No, we there's a letter that Dalhousie wrote to Bathurst when he arrived in the province, and the letter was dated December 29th, 1816. He arrived in October, and so the Black refugees were coming in, and in the letter he said, you know, permit me, my lord, to state nothing can be done for these people. They are slaves by habit and education. The first time I read it, I'm like, what? And he goes on to make all disparaging comments about the Black refugees. So that was my, the letter was what I used to enter into this world of, you know, universities and slavery with respect to my own university. And so there was one letter. And then as I went through his letters to Bathurst, there are 9 letters. There are 7 letters overall from him that we've found so far, and 2 from Bathurst. And these 9 letters, you know, it talks about the arrival and settlement of the refugees, and you know, they go from bad to worse. Point about them being constitutionally lazy, naturally inferior, so on and so forth. So we're just gonna use the letters to discuss Dalhousie's attitude to Black people. And then, but then Dalhousie isn't divorced from Halifax or from Nova Scotia or from the Atlantic world. It's a port town. And what made Halifax, let's say, rich and famous was the West India trade. I mean, it was a small, poor colony. The motto of Halifax is from the sea, it's in Latin, I'm going to say it in English, from the sea comes our wealth. So very earlier on, the colonists, they knew that the sea was it. You know, the province is rocky, it's swampy, it's marshy. It's not going to be any big kind of agricultural things going on, even though later on they did, because they drained the dikes and planted fruits in the Annapolis Valley. The Acadians did that, and then they chased out the Acadians. But anyway, they had this knowing that their wealth was going to come from the sea, and the sea is the West Indies. The sea is New England, and so, you know, then there are all these governors and leading citizens who are connected to the university, but they also were West India traders. So the interconnections were just too vast. There were so many of them, and there's something else. There's something else which kind of slipped my mind now. But then you mentioned it, Asha. You talked about the symbolism of having Levy Hart's mansion now today as the official residence of the president of the school, and Levy Hart was a West Indian trader. Levy Hart made his money off the backs of Black people. The point I wanted to say, which just slipped my mind, was how they used the money. So people like Allman, who was an official at the school, who was a West Indian businessman, used the money, he and 2 other of his colleagues, to establish the Bank of Nova Scotia. And the Bank of Nova Scotia, the first place outside of North America that it opened a branch was Kingston, Jamaica. And it opened that branch so it could regulate this trade. Sugar kind of declined after a while, and then banana became huge, right? It was to regulate the trade coming from the West Indies. Previously, they had British banks and American banks that provided capital for them. And they said, no, we can't do this on our own. Let's pull our capital together. Let's open a bank. And the Bank of Nova Scotia is one of the big 6. Canada has big top 6 top banks. Scotia Bank is one of them. But very early, it knew you talk about follow the money. Very early on, from the beginning of its founding, it knew where to get that money. So we started off really looking at, attitudes and ideology and anti-Black racism. We don't have time for this, but Black people in Nova Scotia were severely marginalized in every way, economically, socially, politically. They lived in segregated communities. There were sundown laws. Don't know if you know what sundown laws are. These are provincial bylaws that says you gotta be off the street by 6 p.m. or 9 p.m., whatever the case. There were sundown bylaws in almost every municipality across the province. And so severe discrimination these people suffered. And when you look at the attitudes of some of the early colonial governors like Dalhousie and Sherbrooke and Kent, who also hated Black people, you could see where, it's from the top down. These are officials. These are people who set the tone. And you had people among them as the century progressed, in the 19th century, who were Confederate supporters. Halifax was a big Confederate city. All the Confederate criminals came up there to hide out. And the founding dean of the medical school had balls and parties and all kinds of activities to raise money for the Confederacy. It's incredible. So are Black people gonna trust these people? Are Black people in that part of Canada are gonna say, well, we trust these guys. Oh, they're gonna own their schools so we can go to their schools, when Black people could even go to high school. For them, many Black people to go to high school, they had to go to New England. They had to go to New Hampshire or Maine or Boston. People who could afford to send their sons and daughters. So it's been a terrible history. So the university has this responsibility to help in whatever way it can to right the wrong.
I've got tons more questions, Michelle, but just tell me when.
Let me.
I mean, is that can I squeeze in another one to respond to that? I wondered, Dr. Cooper, if you could talk a bit more about how you've understood wealth, particularly because of how do we conceptualize wealth in relation to what reparation might mean. And one of the things I noticed in the report was that there was something in the way of an official apology. And I think the language is really interesting in terms of what organizational figures, what political figures feel they can do with language in terms of what that opens them up to legally, what the legal obligations are of making particular acts of apology. So well, I'm not a kind of legal person, but that does seem to be often at stake in the way British politicians have responded to making anything in the way of official apologies for the past. So how do you conceptualize reparation? You talked about the scholarships and the majors in Black studies and the hiring of Black faculty. Are there any other ways you've kind of thought about what reparation might mean?
Well, first on the question of the apology, I'm sure, in fact, I know that they flagged that apology with the lawyers. The interim president didn't just come on stage and read it. The lawyers went through it, they approved it. We actually saw the final product of the apology. And we were satisfied with it. We were prepared to say no if we thought it wasn't, if it was kind of watered down. You know, Danny talks about the bribe. We were prepared to say no, we don't want this. This is not a real apology. But the committee was happy with it. But you know, their lawyers went through a fine-tooth comb, because then they, you know, they didn't want people, I guess, to come up and said, you said that. But we were fortunate. At the time, there was a president, Richard Florizon, he's gone now, he left, who wanted to do this. And so it was really, you know, as we say, the stars were aligned, right? So you had a president who was willing to listen and who said, yes, this is an EDI initiative. When we went with him, It's 200 years. We cannot continue like this for another 200 years. You know, everything was kind of blowing up in his face, really. There were all these student protests, and it's like every week there was another anti-Black graffiti sprawled on a wall across the campus. So he was willing to do that. It's interesting. What is reparations? A check is important. Some people say, look, a check is not only it, and it's true. A check is not the only thing. But having a check or not having a check can make the difference between you eating tonight, or paying your rent, or paying your bus fare, or sending your children to school. So oftentimes when it comes to Black people, people always want to say, well, money isn't the only thing. Well, money is very important. Give me the money. Give me the check. Um, but we conceptualize other things. We wanted scholarships because so many Black people, the students, find it difficult to go to school because school, it's expensive. Tuition fees, come September, Dalhousie is gonna raise tuition fees again. And so if you can get a decent scholarship, that's gonna make the difference between you're going to and finishing university. Staying, retention is a huge thing. If we're talking about Black studies, mobilization and development, we have to have faculty, we have to have staff, we have to have professors. You can't have the same, some of these institutions, it's just, they have the one Black person for 30 years teaching in the Faculty of Arts, like one, and that's supposed to cut it, and one in engineering, and one in physics. So there has to be a targeted hire. But I think somewhere in the report there, we talked about having meetings and visits to primary schools, to junior high schools, and to high schools, because that's where you begin. If we're talking about training people in PhD school, that's fantastic. But if they're not graduating from high school, you're not going to get anyone in PhD school. So our focus is on that now, to develop relationships with the community at large, and with primary school and with high schools. There's a program at Dal called Imhotep Learning Academy, which was put together by a Black physicist, and it's to bring kids, primary school and middle school kids into STEM activity. So start teaching them from the age of 9 about STEM, so they can become mathematicians and physicists, and go to medical school and engineering school. And that's a very successful program, and now it's online, even though they have a physical space. So, but maybe what I want to say about reparations is just this whole issue of culture and heritage, how important that is for people, in this case, African descended people, to know their history, to know their heritage, to know their culture. When you have Black kids in a white dominated society and a white majority society, sometimes the whole issue of shame. I was reading in the UK Guardian this article that Kehinde Andrews wrote on that he was the only Black kid in some special program, gifted child program, and how embarrassed he became, and how he started, along the path of hating himself as a Black person. He was the only Black kid in this gifted program, and feeling that Blackness didn't count, that Black people are kind of stupid, sort of like what Dalhousie was saying. So culture, you see it over and over again, and you see the magic happen when Black children are, they do the arts, they do the dance, they learn about Mansa Musa, or, or whatever it is, how proud they begin to feel. So I think perhaps this is the most important part of reparation, is to return culture to Black people, and not just kids, adults too, right? Because our lineage has been fractured, right? I mean, I still keep up this name Cooper. Why, I don't know. I should get rid of it. Maybe I keep it because my father's name, then my grandfather, whatever. But, you know, even just having this name Cooper, sometimes when I sign it, I'm like, what? What's that all about? So we have these fractured lineage. We have these names that are not ours. We speak English or French or whatever it is. And so in so many ways, our minds are still colonized. And, you know, talk about what Danny mentioned, decolonization, decolonial education. That's probably the most important part of reparations. And are we willing to do that? Are we willing to go down that road? If every Black person within the Western Hemisphere who has a European name were to change their names tomorrow, what would that mean? What would that mean? Would society go berserk? Would people be so willing to say, oh yeah, we'll give you a scholarship? And I said, I actually don't want this name, you know? Call me Afua X or Afua, or whatever.
That's such an interesting, yeah, I'm thinking a lot about that as well. So I just want to jump into some audience questions, and then maybe let's get Danny in for a question if you had any, Danny, afterwards. But I'm going to make this one live because it's a really important one and I don't want to get it wrong. But so it's from Martin Gorski, and he says, thanks, Dr. Cooper, for that wonderful talk. Could you reflect a bit more on the concept of entanglement? It seems on the one hand extremely useful as a metaphor for the enduring colonial legacy, with its hopeful implication that some things can be disentangled through strategies like following the money as you have done, and thus putting a price on restitution. Yet at the same time, it is daunting, for despite the moral case it presents for reparation, there is so much that cannot now be meaningfully disentangled, given the enormity of slavery's economic legacy?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good question, and thanks to the person who asked it. And I think that's the point I ended on. So many things cannot be disentangled, you know, and the point of the name or names, the point that we all speak in English right now, we can't disentangle that, really. Maybe we could, but, you know, that's another story. I'm gonna stick to my point about that the money is important, because if the money wasn't important, then we wouldn't have, I don't know what this stat says for the UK, but in certainly North America, white people are 10 times richer than Black people, right? As we speak today, last week, there was a webinar from the federal government, and they had all these economist type people speaking about a Black man or a Black woman with a university degree who enters the workforce in Canada will earn $20,000 less than a white person. The same degree, same age. Why is that? It's not because one is more qualified than the other. Why is that? These are structural issues that have plagued a society with respect to Black marginalization for the past 400 years. $20,000, when you multiply that over the course, let's say that person is in the workforce for 20, 30 years, when you multiply that, that's a lot of money. That's gonna make the difference between a person being able to buy a house, to get a mortgage, to pay successfully on the mortgage. That's gonna impact their retirement. You know, the more money you have in your salary as you near the retirement age, the better it is. And so we find Black people still scrambling at retirement, still doing these sessional jobs, still doing temporary work, even with their big degrees, right? Even with their PhDs. So it is a huge discussion, and so many people have written about it from different angles. And so it's important for us to kind of to read what other people are saying. But I'm still gonna stick to the point that the money is important. Maybe certain cultural things cannot be disentangled, and perhaps they can. Like if we get the money, we can disentangle some of these cultural things that But, I do take the point that after 400 years of slavery and misery, um, when it's not only economy, it's also psychology, it's one's psyche, it's ideology. So many things have played into making the modern world as it is, into creating us as people, creating us as a humanity, to creating Black people, white people, and others. Um, we are kind of in this matrix, but we don't occupy the same place at the same time. And members of the Black community are still just asking for human rights, for equal rights. Still a ask. It hasn't happened yet.
Danny, did you want to jump in?
Yes, so I just wanted to also just make a point on the kind of like reparations in terms of like monetary value and stuff. Like, there's this part of like the system that is so capitalist that it's just like, yeah, actually, like part of that does come with money being part of those reparations. But I do really agree with Dr. Cooper in the sense that, our last names, right? The fact that I can like at the moment I'm doing my family tree and I can only kind of go back so far because names have changed and there are different kind of areas of like migration and things like that. That type of stuff is actually something that is so it's been taken away almost. It exists somewhere out there, but to go on that journey to piece all that together, it actually feels quite difficult and frustrating at that realization that it has kind of been pulled apart in that type of way. And I think many people who are within like the Black diaspora are still dealing with those kind of stories and areas of like kind of connection. My question is around, what do you think the future kind of looks like in terms of elements of anti-racism? Were there points in doing the research and report that you had to kind of take a step back? So it's kind of a two-pronged kind of question. So what do you think of the future? What were there any moments that you personally had to kind of take something back, or something that took you by surprise maybe in the research?
Thank you, Danny. I think in terms of what do I think of the future, with respect to the report, with respect to the university, making good on its promise, we had 13 recommendations, and the president said we accept all of them. But it has been a struggle because there's this inertia in the system, whether it's a constructed inertia or it's just, organic. But the inertia is there, where you write these reports and you do these publications and people say, yeah, great, we love it, we're gonna follow through, but then they don't. Because in our case, the president and the provost left. So the two top people left, and the incoming people might not be that interested in it. So then you have to be kind of there saying, hey, look at this. This report shouldn't die. Look at this. And you have to go to community. And so you kind of have to do this work to make sure that they, make good on their promise. And so that's where we are now. We still have a little committee, and our job is to ensure that the university follows through on the promises, in terms of the recommendation. Some of the things have happened, like the apology happened, the Sankofa scholarships happened. We're doing the Black Studies major. But it's kind of frustrating because you're thinking, if I leave or someone else leaves, then really what's going to happen? Because the commitment, it seems to me, you know, in light of George Floyd and in light of students demonstrating in the city and on the campus, then members, the white community got kind of really panicked. They panicked and they said, oh, well, we better do this. We better implement the recommendations. But when the pressure is let up, then they go back to same old, same old. And so this is where the struggle can't be confined to one place. It has to be across board, it has to be across structures. People who work in civil service are part of it. Nurses and medical people are part of it, because now you see that COVID has disproportionately impacted the Black community, same thing in Canada. And so it has to be like this a kind of groundswell of activism, but also a collaboration between the different groups in society. And I that's happening, and I'm heartened by that. Many people, youth, students, they see that they are the architects of their own liberation, and that's also great, because you know they're not standing back and waiting. And people are so empowered. People are speaking in a voice that I've never heard before. I mean, in Canada, the federal government is like the national government, right? And the federal government supersedes all the other governments, province and city. And just about 6 weeks ago, the Black federal civil servants, including former civil servants, launched a lawsuit against the federal government for anti-Black racism. The oldest person in that lawsuit is about 80 years old, because you can go back to the past. Even if you're not currently employed by the federal government, you can be part of the suit. There's something like 600 people are part of the suit, and they're telling their stories. It's oh my goodness. What happened to them. And I was mentioning this thing about pension, you know, or promotion, people writing you a letter of recommendation, but they won't write you a letter of recommendation because they thought you were too uppity, so you're in that position forever. So who would have thought that you'd have hundreds of people suing the federal government, hundreds of Black people suing the federal government and saying, you have robbed me of my pension. You have robbed me of promotion. I'm so stressed that I had to see a psychiatrist for 10 years. You have robbed me of the ability to buy a house, right? You have robbed me because you send white people in and I train them and they get promoted and I'm still here. I've been here for 30 years. I haven't moved. So I'm hopeful. Things have to change. Like you said, it's messy. It's gonna be messy. It's gonna be difficult. It's gonna be hard. But if we really want to get back some kind of equilibrium in the world, this has to happen. This has to happen. So what do I think of the future? That's my response. And what was the other question? The other part of the question?
So the other part of the question was, were there any points in doing this research and doing the report that took you back or took you by surprise, or were difficult as well?
Oh yeah, when we looked at the custom documents, the custom report, because they do it yearly. It's yearly. And if you look at it for 5 years, I mean, it's a lot. If you look at it for 30 years, which my colleague, Professor Tillotson did, she looked at it beyond 10 years. I know she's even gone further. You're thinking, oh my God, this is not a fable. This is not a fairy tale. They really were getting this money from the sugar trade, from the West Indies. This is what kept the province going. So that was surprising to me. But it was a hard report to write, not in the sense, you know, in terms of actually writing it, but just you deal with a lot of distress. It was very distressing. Learning some of the, you know, the facts, so to speak, and then having to go through these documents and then having to write it in light of the current situation that we live in like when you see how Black children are chased out of school, when you see, you know, Black people beaten to death by the cops, and then you're reading these documents that show the segregated communities where they lived in without electricity, without running water up until 1972. So that was distressing, because it's not like you're this quote unquote, you know, dealing with the hard facts, and you're this research and academic, and you're just dealing with the facts and writing what's true, this whole objectivity thing. It impacted me as a person. It impacted me as a Black woman, because I'm saying these were my people who were being given the boot, who were denied so many opportunities. And this is, you talk about wealth, they have lost hundreds of millions of dollars because of the way they were treated. So it's hard. It's a lot of pain and suffering. I endured a lot of pain and suffering.
Yeah, I feel like no one ever talks about the emotional toll of this kind of work. So thank you very much for speaking of that. So I want to kind of roll a couple of questions together, but there are several on Dalhousie, and I think kind of what to do with the legacy. And so Katie Hill wants to know, what's the solution to how we deal with the legacy, particularly because the university is named after him. And another person also kind of raised that question. She says, do we simply change the name to knock down the pedestal these figures have been placed on? Or does the need to understand why we revered such people as a reflection of colonial society mean that we should retain the names? So that's question one. Should we keep the name? Should we get rid of them? Also, I see that we have Sean who raised his hand. And so I want to invite you, Sean, if you still would like to ask your question or comment. So I'm going to allow you to talk.
Right. Hello, Afua. I hope you're well. You're looking well, and my best wishes to your daughter. Nice to see you. Yeah, when I came to your conference, gosh, it must be about 5 years now, and gave a paper on the Black British links. Some of what you've mentioned in the research, we already knew, just little snapshots. And what your research has done is to pull it together and give us much more in-depth understanding in a way that should be of aid to any other university that is looking at its own role and legacies. I've been working with Durham University academic staff and their students for the last 3 years, and we've raised a number of issues about the legacies of enslavement into the university because it was founded after emancipation. But also, interestingly, because of the complexity of universities, it became the university that granted degrees for students at the Sierra Leone Fora Bay College. And one of my recommendations to the university is they do a major study of those links and who actually benefited. And of course, many of the students who got those degrees will have been descendants of the Black settlers from Nova Scotia. But two particular questions I've got are firstly, in terms of the continuing involvement of Nova Scotia with the West Indies, when I was at your conference, I did find in the archives the papers of a fishing trading firm with the West Indies based in Nova Scotia. But very little else. And I'm just wondering if that's an area of further research, not linked so much to the university, but to be looked at on the agenda. The other thing in terms of legacies is we know that in Britain, many of the people who supported Governor Eyre's suppression of the Morant Bay revolt in Jamaica had involvements in enslavement through families or directly. I was just wondering what the reaction in Canada was from those same kind of people who were still around, whether they were supporting Eyre and whether there was a campaign, as in Britain, against Eyre. Yeah, those are the two particular questions I've got. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much for your questions. And thank you for coming to this webinar. I do appreciate it, and nice to see you again or hear your voice. Yes, it was 5 years since we had that conference. And so back to your questions. In terms of this continuing relationship between NS and the West Indies area for further research, definitely, I think in the areas of banking, shipping and insurance, there are about five businessmen who were West India merchants, as they were called, who launched off. So Alman was one of them. They're very well-known family. There are streets named after them in Nova Scotia. Alman was one of them. He started the Bank of Nova Scotia. Then there's Collins, Enos Collins, who upon his death was reputed to be the richest man in British North America. He founded the Collins Bank, which later became the CIBC, Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. In the area of shipping, Cunard is a huge name, right? Cunard, the White Star Line, and like just a huge maritime success story. That's another name. So shipping, banking, and insurance. And you're gonna find the same names across these sectors, right? Alman was, he worked for a British insurance company, and then he went and launched his own, the Colonial Insurance Company. So, and not just the shipping in terms of carrying people or carrying goods to and fro, but also shipbuilding. The timber trade is huge. The timber trade, especially from New Brunswick to the West Indies. And then we factor Bermuda there inside of that whole circuit. Bermuda was also very important because Bermuda was one of it was a summer station for the British Navy. I mean, Halifax was a Halifax was a summer station. Bermuda was a winter station because when winter came in the north, the Navy went further south to Bermuda. So there are all those definitely areas of research that people can pick up on. In terms of 1865, I'm not sure what the mood was in Nova Scotia, if folks were supporting Governor Eyre or not. I think there would be people who would support Governor Eyre, and there would be people who wouldn't support him, because people who would support him would be members of like the Johnson, the Alman family, perhaps, because they were supportive of the Confederacy. They didn't want abolition to happen in the United States. So I think they would be right up there supporting Governor Eyre, but there would be people in Halifax who wouldn't support Governor Eyre. There are always folks in the white community who were against slavery and who were against racism, and who would speak out on the side of justice. But that's an area that certainly demands inquiry. 1865 in Canada as a whole, I'm not sure. But thank you for your questions.
So we also have a question about from Jonathan Lightfoot. He asks, how do we dispel the myth that Black people were treated better in Canada?
Well, we are dispelling the myth. It's a very strong myth. I mean, I thought when I was undergraduate, we were on the verge of success. But 30 years later, I'm not so sure, but it's there's more as people, as this knowledge becomes part of people's consciousness, as folks are using all kinds of platform to get the information out, especially with social media. Today or yesterday, 1st of March, February 28th, the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was on TV. It was the end of Black History Month in Canada, and he was talking about systemic racism and anti-Black racism. And I thought, great, potentially millions of people are listening to the Prime Minister, and if he's saying there's a problem in Canada with systemic racism, that Canada is a racist country, then some people may just say, okay, that could be true. The Prime Minister is saying it. But the work continues. That's all I can say to that. We continue to do the work. We continue to mobilize this knowledge and continue to speak out. Some people, no matter what you say, they're still gonna believe that myth.
And just to jump in there, I think that was one of the things that struck me in reading this report too, was that benign myth also applies to Britain. And it's interesting to think about the kind of Britain-Canada relationship, and whereby they seem to seem automatically progressive by virtue of the contrast to the United States. And that seems to be part of the myth at stake there too.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a question about if you feel that there are any, because there seems to be individuals in power in universities who are unwilling to relinquish their power and acknowledge these issues. Do you feel that there are any institutions that are leading by example of how to make positive progress in this area of redress?
I actually can't think of one. Honestly, I could say that Dalhousie University was the first university in Canada to launch this investigation, right? And we did a historical inquiry. We wanted to go into history. We wanted to look into the archives. We wanted to look at those documents. We didn't want to just do something for present day and said, oh, we have all these, security people on campus harassing Black students, and that's all there is to it. So in a way, if let's say we began there, but we kind of held on to that thread and it took us into the past, right? So Black students were suffering on campus. I mean, they had their end of year parties busted in by the security because someone phoned and said they're making noise. Even though the students had their permit to have a end of year party. These are student societies, you had to have permit, they had their permit, someone called. So all that was happening, and we're saying, well, where is this coming from? What are the roots of these activities and this kind of behavior? So I think maybe because I'm a historian, I wanted to look into history, and we're celebrating 200 years. It's 200 years, right? 1818. So of course we're gonna have to go back. We also wanted to identify as best as we could Black students who graduated from the institution over the course of, the past 200 years. And so Dalhousie University did that, and they made a big, it was all in the media. But like I was saying earlier, now it comes to implementing those recommendations, and that's when things got stalled. There's a momentum right now because, there are people who said, look, this has to happen. I can't think of an institution that really wants to overturn the power structure. Definitely not the banks, definitely not the insurance companies, definitely not the academy, definitely not the civil service, because white power has been so entrenched in these places for hundreds of years that some people are going to have a nervous breakdown to even think that they're going to be decentered even for a little while. So, but the work continues, because what it is that folks are asking for, asking to be returned to them, are claiming, let me put it another way, folks, in this case, Black people, are claiming their humanity. We're not. Someone on the panel talked about just the physical labor of doing this work, or cutting cane, or processing sugar, or making the barrels, and so on, which kind of, you know, it's almost as if we were machines or animals, right? And Black people are, they said, hey, we are claiming our humanity. Some people are going to find that difficult to take.
I really like that as like a final note, that Black people are claiming their humanity. I feel like I don't want anything else to be said beyond that important point. So that's a beautiful way to kind of wrap up the discussion there. Dr. Cooper, thank you so much for sharing this report with us. It was such a wonderful presentation. I know we all did learn so much, and thank you, Asha and Danny, for just such illuminating and thought-provoking reflections, and to our audience who asked such good questions. And there's so much praise here. There's more praise than questions, but also really good questions here for you to go through. Thank you all for being with us here this evening. I want to be sure to invite you to our future event. So the next event for the Center for the Study of North America is this coming March 24th, and it's on the history of far white supremacy. And so we'll have discussants there who will be discussing that history and the ways in which this has propped up in far right movements in North America and also in the UK. And that's being put forth by Dr. Steve Hewitt. And you can find more on that at Eventbrite. So I hope you all will join us for that. Thank you again to our discussants and especially to Dr. Cooper. Thank you to Matt Cluley, who has been providing tech support behind the scenes and doing such a fantastic job. And of course, last but certainly not least, thank you to John Monroe. He is out there in the internet lands who envisioned this panel. Thank you all. Have a pleasant evening, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Michelle, and the panelists, the discussant. It was my great pleasure, and I'm so happy to have shared this evening with you. Thanks to the audience.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks so much.
Bye.